Okay, so you join me today in my workshop shed. I've got the PC here. It's actually another day. I ran out of time to crack on with the delidding experiment after I'd done all the temperature benchmarking. So I thought I'd save it for another day when I wasn't rushing for time. It's now 12:30, so I've got the rest of the afternoon free to take my time on this. But I've got the PC here in the workshop, and I'm going to remove the CPU now and start the delidding. I've got my Delid-die-mate here, delidding tool, so let's get the CPU out and get cracking with the job. Ta-da! Right, now I'll just clean that up and we can start using the tool to delid it. Okay, so we've got the chip out now, so first thing I need to do is clean it up. Get the existing thermal compound off the chip. I've put it in the Delid-die-mate just so that I've got something to sort of hold it still. What I can do, I think it'll be alright like that actually. I'm just going to use a bit of tissue and a little dab of isopropyl alcohol to clean it off. So I'll start just by cleaning it straight with the tissue. Okay, so that's looking pretty clean now. I'm happy with that. While I'm here, I'm also going to clean off the bottom of the heat sink as well. So that's pretty clean now, so that's done out of the way. Okay, so now I've got that cleaned up, and I have to remove the heat spreader. So with the corners of the CPU, the triangle on the corner of the CPU lined up with the triangle on the corner of the Delid-die-mate, slot this bit back into the groove, and then take my screw, put that back through, tighten it up by hand until it's tight, and then this is the scary part. So you see where the heat spreader is at the moment, and now we just have to turn this clockwise. Yeah, it's tight, and just keep turning until we feel it give. I think this one's on a bit tighter than the i3 that I did before. I can feel it going. There it goes. That all came off in one motion. Literally just sprung off. So I'll undo that. Done a bit of a number on that washer there. Oh, that was quite tight. There we go. Flip that over. You'll see this time the heat spreader is actually fallen straight off. When I did the i3 it was still tacky and attached, whereas this has just completely come apart. So now, next stage is to clean up the thermal compound that's on the die there, and then clean up the gully residue, and do the same on the top of the heat spreader, or bottom of the heat spreader. Okay. So the same process as before. Use a tissue, a little bit of isopropyl alcohol to clean off the thermal compound. Yeah, most of the thermal compound is actually stuck to the underside of the heat spreader. It's just flaking off. Well, that's got the thermal compound off. On there. Now the tricky bit is cleaning off the residue from the adhesive. Yeah. So the best tool for using to get the plastic off is a plastic spudger. So not the plastic, the adhesive. So I've got like a plastic spudger here. These usually come with like frame repair kits off of eBay. They're really cheap plasticky things, but because it's plastic, it shouldn't harm the chip. So you just basically need to go around and try and scrape off this adhesive. With how that's looking now. So we don't have to get it perfectly clean, but what we're looking to do is get the majority of it off so that we can get a good sort of mating with the chip. What we want it to do is sit tight when we put it down on top. We want it to sit tight against the die on the CPU. We don't want it to be lifted by that barrier of old adhesive. So that's that, and I'll just give the chip one more spray and a wipe over. I'm quite happy with that. Again, the important thing is that the die is clean. That's the bit that gets hot, and that's the bit that we want to transfer the heat away from. Around it, you just need to get the majority of the glue off so that we get a good flat surface to make the heat spreader back onto. So the last time I did this, I tried a few different methods of reattaching the heat spreader, and I concluded that the best results from a temperature perspective were done without using any kind of gasket seal. Now the problem with that is that your heat spreader is literally floating, for want of a better term. It's not fixed back to the CPU. This is going back in the machine, and it's going to stay in the machine, and the machine is going to be moved around from time to time because I take it to LAN parties. So I want to make sure that the heat spreader is attached. I have still got a little bit of RTV gasket sealer, so I am going to use a couple of dabs of that. I'm not going to put very much on a tool actually, because I just literally want to hold the heat spreader in place. And I'm going to use the same Arctic MX4 compound that I used previously. I've got gloves on because the RTV gasket maker is nasty stuff, and I don't really want to get it on my bare skins because it will cause irritation. Okay, so what I'm going to do now the die is clean, I'm going to take my thermal compound. I'm going to put a tiny little dot in the middle, about a grain of rice, as much as you want, that much there. And I'll put the lid back on that, making sure the arrows are lined up. The die mate comes with a very handy tool for lining up the heat spreader to put it back on. So I'm going to put that tool over the top there in place, and then the heat spreader with these corners here, the corner goes in the bottom left. The heat spreader wants to go with the text the right way up, sit in there. So I'm going to take, because it's messy stuff, I've got a little bit of cardboard here. I'm just going to get a tiny dab of the RTV sealant. Just going to put a little bit on each side of the heat spreader here. And then I'm going to put that into place. There we go. And then we take the clamp tool here, put that over the top, like so, and we do it up tight, making sure everything stays in place. Do that up. And I'm going to leave that for maybe an hour just to cure a bit, and then I'll come back and fit it back into the case. Check everything works, then we can put the heatsink back together and do some benchmarks. Okay, so I've waited what I consider to be a reasonable length of time, as about an hour. In an ideal world, I would leave it longer, maybe overnight, but I'm a little impatient and I want to crack on with this, so I'm going to undo this clamp now. Should be sufficient time for it to hold in place anyway. And once it's in the case, the clamp from the heatsink is going to hold the heat spreader in place anyway. So there's the chip, drop it out of there, and it's ready to go back in the PC. Line the corners up, it goes in that way round, the little notches hold it in place, and then we'll pop the clamp back down on the CPU, and that's held in place. So the CPU retaining bracket actually holds tight against the side of the heat spreader, so if it's not glued on that well, it might move when you mount the CPU back in the case. In this instance it hasn't moved, so I'm quite happy with that. It seems to have held nicely, and that's all going to hold it in place now anyway. So I just give the top of that heatsink another quick wipe from the spot of IPA alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, and put a fresh application of the Arctic MX4 compound on. So again, I'm just going to put a little blob on there. Spread it slightly, and then put the heatsink back on, and then we will get the thumb screws and tighten that back up. Alright, now I'm going to plug it in and just make sure it powers up okay. Okay, right, so we're plugged in. I'm just going to fire it up and see what happens. Wish me luck. Okay, it's not powering on, so that means something's not right. Yeah, so the most likely cause here, because the obvious thing is I've been tweaking, or I've had the CPU out. It's most likely going to be that's the issue here. So I will remount the CPU. No, definitely doesn't want to go, does it? Okay, so that was rather a tense few minutes. It appears somehow, in the process of replacing the CPU, I'd managed to bend one of the pins on the CPU socket on the motherboard. I've got another CPU here. This is, let me just remove the thermal compound from it. This is an old dual, well I say old, it's not that old, but this is a Pentium dual core G4560. It's 3.5 gigahertz, and this is the original CPU that I built this PC with. I was going for a real budget build, and this Pentium, when it was launched, sort of set a new benchmark for budget performance, because it was the first Pentium dual core to have hyperthreading, which meant effectively you were getting an i3 for Pentium money, and it was a very, very good performer for games, but I've upgraded to an i5. Anyway, I digress. Tested this CPU, same board, still wouldn't boot, so then I figured probably not the CPU that's broken, but there's something not right there. The diagnostic lights on the BIOS, on the motherboard, were saying there was a problem with the CPU and RAM, flickering between the two. I know the RAM's good because it was working before I took it out, but I tested it with one module, exactly the same. So took everything out, give it a good clean, tried resetting the BIOS settings, still nothing. And then when I got my magnifying glass out and checked carefully, one pin on the CPU socket was bent slightly. I actually sprayed a little bit of isopropyl alcohol on the socket to try and make sure the pins were clean, and when it was wet, it showed up more obviously that one of the pins didn't quite line up properly. Tiny screwdriver, moved it back into position, popped the CPU back in, and now it's booting fine. So there's a lesson for you. Be very careful when you're removing and inserting CPUs not to damage the CPU socket, because obviously I was being a little careless and my fat fingers have managed to bend one of the pins on the CPU socket. And you don't want to do that. So PC's booted now. What I'm going to do, because I'm only running it with one memory module at the moment, I'm just going to pop the other memory module back in. Just want to make sure it boots at this point, because I'm going to have to go and reconfigure all of the BIOS settings again to put my overclock back in, because in the process of getting the machine to boot again after bending the pin on the CPU socket, I've had to reset all the BIOS settings. If we're below 30s, it's definitely making good contact, so it's keeping the CPU cool. So let's shut that down. I'm happy with that. What I'll do now, I'm going to reattach the fans, and then going to put the case back together. I'm going to take it upstairs, and then I'm going to reprogram all the BIOS settings back in, including the overclock, and we'll do some proper benchmarking. So there we go. Right, so with the CPU fan back on, it's booted, it's running absolutely fine. Right, so I'm going to shut this down and take it upstairs.